So today I wanted to give you my thoughts on where I see the major Latin American economies headed. Now I tend to take a longer term view of growth, so I'd like to give you more of a big picture view of the region and talk about not only where I see the economies headed over the next year, but also over the next several years. To do that, I think it would be useful to describe a few key characteristics of the region that have developed over the last decade or so, because these are the characteristics that I think have supported the region throughout the global crisis over the last several years, and also will continue to be key determinants of economic growth into the future. And after I do that, I'd like to mention a few barriers that I think are currently preventing the region from achieving the next step in its economic growth, achieving growth rates strong enough to take it from developing world to developed world status. So first of all, what are these key structural factors? So political stability. Over the last decade or so, political stability has come, I think, in force to Latin America. So first of all, what this means is that political institutions are much stronger. Political democracy is much more entrenched. So whenever you see a transition in power from one administration to the next, it's relatively uneventful. Coups are no longer the norm. And a second aspect of this, and I think more important for this presentation, is you've seen this convergence across party lines of what it means to have good economic policy. And I think this is an extremely important development, extremely important precondition for actual credible macroeconomic policy. Because if an administration comes into power, puts into place good economic policy, but outside parties, like investors, like businesses, if they don't think those parties or those policies will continue into the next administration, if they think the next administration will change them, they'll likely avoid the country. So I think this policy continuity you see more and more of from one administration to the next, especially when it comes to economic policy, is a major development, extremely important. A second major factor is actually the policies themselves. So over the last several years, over the crisis, Latin American policymakers have proven themselves extremely competent and extremely able. So in the middle of the crisis, they put into place countercyclical fiscal policies, monetary policies. They loosened liquidity requirements and capital requirements on banks, all with the goal of supporting the domestic economy. And they were able to do this because monetary and fiscal institutions were strengthened in the run-up to the crisis. So when it comes to fiscal institutions, what this means is that before the crisis, public spending was cut back. Public deficits reduced, public debt loads were cut. And also, you've seen the shift in the region towards more of a rules-based fiscal policy that has more of a focus on medium-term sustainability, so saving in the good times and spending during the bad times, but over a complete business cycle, largely having a balanced budget. And when it comes to monetary institutions, most of the major central banks in the region, if they aren't legally independent, they're at least operationally independent. So they are largely free of political influence. This is not absolutely true, of course. There are some exceptions, like in Argentina, with major interference in the central bank. But in most of the major countries, this is true. And also in terms of monetary policy, I think you've seen the shift towards more of a rules-based system, specifically inflation targeting, which makes monetary policy a lot more predictable, and it gives outside parties, it gives investors, it gives businesses a clear-cut criterion against which to judge the performance of the central bank. If the central bank says it's going to keep inflation between 4% and 6%, it's easy enough to check, in most cases, well, if the data is reliable, which is in question sometimes. And another policy, which I actually don't have on the slide, is banking and financial regulation, which, relative to the US at least, it was much stricter So the region as a whole did not see much exposure to toxic assets and did not have an excessive amount of debt. So coming out of the crisis, they were able to recover much more quickly because they didn't have this debt overhang. So in a third factor, and I think this factor is much less important in explaining past behavior over the last several years, but it'll become more important in the future, is a shift in Latin America's trading and investing relationships, specifically a shift from the U.S. towards emerging markets and really towards China. The extent of this relationship has grown at pretty high rates over the last few years, but it's grown from a pretty low level. So currently, the relationship, I think, is not that important, but over the next 5 years or so, it will become a major, I think, determining factor of the region's economic performance. So as we go through the regional overview and then Brazil and Mexico, keep these in mind because I think these are some of the major factors at least supporting growth and driving growth in the future. So what about the region's actual economic performance? So of course it went into recession in 2009, contracted by about 2%. It came back pretty strongly in 2010 and grew nearly 6%. Some of this was pent-up demand that was released. People were restricting their spending during the crisis, and when some of the uncertainty was resolved, they made up for lost time, essentially, and spent more. And the external environment improved to some degree. So as you move from 2010 to 2011, though, expect to see a pretty significant drop in the growth rate, probably from 6% to 4%. And that's going to be for a few reasons. One is demand is going to go back to more normal levels, so this pent-up demand is going to be exhausted. And then also, hopefully, as inflationary pressures increase, which they are now, generally, governments will withdraw stimulus. So fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. Monetary stimulus is actually being withdrawn, and fiscal stimulus, hopefully these governments get on the ball and actually do that, but there's some question about that. So in 2011, expect to see 4% give or take growth rates, and going forward, expect to see the same thing, I think, which is a solid growth rate, but it's not amazing. If these countries want to significantly improve their standards of living, if they want to converge with the developed world, they need growth rates of closer to 6%, and they need those growth rates for an extended amount of time. So how do they get them? I think one of the major ways they can get them is by increasing their productivity. So the region as a whole has pretty poor capital. So to increase its increase its productivity, it needs to invest heavily in both human capital and physical capital. So when it comes to human capital, this means the region needs to invest in education, which is pretty abysmal across across all of Latin America. I think even if kids go to school, they get extremely poor instruction. So going to school is only one measure of the quality. And also it's healthcare. Even if you have people who are knowledgeable, if they only live to 20 or 30, it's not much use. So in terms of physical capital, though, one of the major areas they can address is infrastructure. So you can think about transportation infrastructure, so airports, ports, roads, maybe public transit systems, and also energy infrastructure, so energy generation capacity, power plants, and also distribution of that energy. Because even if you can produce stuff cheaply there, if power is unreliable or if you're not sure how you're going to get the product from A to B, none of that matters. So if the region as a whole can address this productivity issue, I think it has a bright future. If it doesn't, though, I think it will probably largely stagnate economically, and the promise it sees right now will largely be wasted.